Hi everybody. Thank you for that, Carl. Hope I'm connected. Great. Well, thanks for inviting me. Yes, I'm Jonathan Thompson, Disability and Dyslexia Manager at London South Bank University, and I'll give you a snapshot really of how we're supporting dyslexic students and how traditionally we're supporting dyslexic students, as well as really what we're working towards, and it reflects what's happening in the sector as well. And I really hope for those parents or those working in schools and colleges, you can see that things are improving in higher education, and it'll be a supportive place to be. So we are removing barriers, but we're still 1 foot in what I call the medical model and 1 foot in the social model. So you might have heard that already, but it's a good starting point to explain the barriers, and I'll start on that. Okay, so yeah, could I have the first slide, please, Neil?
Sure, bear with me.
I think it's just my introduction, but I'll give you a brief intro of myself, and then we'll move. Great, thanks, Neil. So my background, I studied art and design, and as we were talking about, I'm very right-brained and struggled at school, but I kind of excelled in the visual arts, and I really found that was my strength, and parents are very supportive. Not many parents encourage you to go to art school, but mine did, which was a great thing. And literally, I went just down the road to Campbell School of Arts. I say down the road, so we have London South Bank, sort of near the Elephant and Castle. If you go further south, you come to an area called Camberwell, and it was a very good art school, still is. A great tradition in drawing, and I was from the New Forest, so getting there was very exciting. So that was the start of my journey. In terms of then coming into education, I started to work with adults with learning difficulties. I could use my creativity in supporting students with very little verbal skills or a physical disability as well. And I found that the arts was a great tool to communicate. And I had a strength in facilitating that, using that to enable others to grow in their confidence and do some extraordinary artwork. I've come into higher education through lecturing, being a teacher in art and design, and then used my sort of background in supporting others in higher education. Also involved with, it's called NADP, National Association for Disability Practitioners. This is a membership organisation for disability practitioners in the UK. It's all, I say disability practitioners, there'd be disability advisors or disability support managers working in tertiary education, FE and HE. We have a membership scheme to support those supporters, and we're sort of always looking to progress the practice and what we're doing in higher education. The next slide, please, Neil. So I remember about 20 years ago in higher education, we started talking about the social model, and people just glaze over you, and they really didn't know what it meant. And this diagram sort of explains that the problem is not with the individual, but traditionally it was seen that the problem was with the individual. The wheelchair user can't access the campus. The blind, the deaf students can't hear, so can't access the lecture. So the problem with the individual, whereas the social model turns all that upside down and saying actually the barriers exist with the environment we create. And in education, higher education, there are many constructs, the time-constrained examinations, the flights of stairs to the lecture theatre, the processes and the procedures, the time constraints, when things have to be handed in, the hundreds of students in the lecture theatre, with one lecturer talking at you for 2 hours. So they can be the barrier, not the disability or the medical condition. But interestingly, I think for those who are neurodiverse, we haven't really applied the social model to neurodiverse students. Perhaps we are starting to, but traditionally it was with those groups of students I just mentioned, the wheelchair user, the blind student, the deaf student. But for those with neurodiversity, it was very much, well, that's specific learning difficulty, you need a diagnostic assessment, you need specialist tutors, rather than saying, isn't it the way we're educating our students? Maybe that's exacerbating the difficulty, exacerbating we're not tapping in on that right brain. Next slide, please, Neil. So they're the traditional sort of range of practices we still do. As I said, we'll put 1 foot in sort of the medical model. So we will screen students for neurodiversity. Then we'll recommend a diagnostic assessment. At LSBU, we pay for that. That's quite expensive, £350 or more for a diagnostic assessment, and we will fund that for students. Currently, we've got 831 students with a specific learning difference. That will increase as we go throughout the year. So by the end of the academic year, it'll be about, in total, 2,000 registered, around 50%, 50 to 60% of those will be those with a specific learning difference, dyslexia or ADHD. But from that diagnostic assessment, we arrange funding, whether it's LSBU funded or a thing called the Disabled Students Allowance. If you're not in the UK, you might not be aware of what that is. It's a government funded allowance where we can provide support for students that's paid for by the government. Assistive technology is very key, text to speech, and as well as other mind mapping tools, really, really important part of the support package. And our standard package of adjustments have always traditionally been, I'm just gonna move the range of people looking at me to my right screen. Yeah, this is the minimal amount of adjustments we'll provide a dyslexic student. So 25% extra time, late submission of coursework, and there's also a policy called the sensitive marking policy, which is really asking academics to mark for content, not for grammar or spelling. And I'll come on to that. It's interesting, it's a bit of a hot potato in the last few weeks, and papers come from the Office for Students all about that very thing, and they're suggesting that actually academics should be marking for grammar and good English. But I'll hint on that later on. How are we doing for time? I think we'll go on to the next slide. Hopefully we'll have questions at the end. Okay, so we've got the social model. There's sort of 3, if you like, structures or models that we're using. One is the social model. The other one is inclusive practice. The government in 2016 was saying to universities, look, we're not going to fund in-class support anymore. We're not going to fund a note taker. If you can ensure your practices are inclusive, make sure you're recording your lectures, and that will mitigate the barriers, which is like, well, yeah, that's great. It's taken a few years for universities to have a full lecture recording system in their lecture on the campuses, but we're beginning to do that. So recording lectures and providing that before and at the end of the lecture. And so this is an example of a few bullet points of some of the things we're recommending to our academic teams. So my team of dyslexia and disability and dyslexia advisors, traditionally student facing, fixing the problem for the individual, giving them the adjustment. But we're beginning to move away partly from that and become more staff facing and working with staff to look at inclusive practice. So we'll give them a range of recommendations. This is just a snapshot. For a dyslexic student, for example, as well as doing the extra time, but provide an overview of a lecture at the beginning and sum up at the end. Allow additional time for processing of information. Aim to ensure the deadlines coincide as little as possible. Ensure handouts are available before the lecture and reading lists are given in advance. And be aware of the pace of the lecture and encourage the use of recording devices as well as Panopto to capture lectures. Panopto is a product that a lot of universities are adopting. It's a lecture capture system, and putting it installed on in the PCs in the lecture theatres, but also on lecturers' laptops, so they can record and audio and visual, and then they can put that recording up on the virtual learning environment for students to access. Okay, next slide. And this is to be the third, if you like, is it model? I'm trying to think of the right word. Tool that we can use to further the inclusion of students is universal design for learning. And we'll play a video which will explain it better than I will. But briefly, it's ensuring our curriculum is fostering engagement for students. So that's fostering collaboration and group work. Thinking about the representation of the learning outcomes. So providing students with different types of media to support the learning, and also action and expression, providing students with a choice of assessment modes. That's one of the biggest hurdles. It was interesting when we went into lockdown 18 months ago, the university went straight to open book exams, 24-hour open book exams, and late submission wasn't a problem. There's now been a rush to come on campus, and it's almost as if all that good practice has just been forgotten about. And we have gone back to traditional modes of assessment. And it's a difficult one, and I can touch on that a bit later, but some courses have professional competencies, so they're worried about parity and ensuring that they meet the requirements of that profession. Others are just not confident that they can assess in a different way. Okay, well, I think we'll go on to the Association for Higher Education, Access and Disability. It's called AHEAD. They're actually an Irish organisation I've got a lot of respect for. They're funded by the government, I believe, and they do a lot of work to promote inclusion in higher education. We don't have an equivalent here in the UK, but we've got a great little video will explain about UDL.
Imagine you went into a big clothes store and all that was on sale was one type of outfit, in one size, with no thought given to different individual body shapes or personalities. That would be crazy, right? Expecting everyone to be able to fit into the same size and express themselves in the same colour and style? Yet in many cases, that's exactly what is happening in our education system. When it comes to learning, variability is the rule, not the exception, and our college campuses are now grappling with the demands of an increasingly diverse cohort of learners, with increasing numbers of international students, students from different cultural and socio-economic backgrounds, mature students, and students with disabilities. Despite this, curriculums are still designed for the mythical average learner, and all are expected to engage and learn on the same terms. Not enough flexibility is built in at the design stage to give all students equal opportunities to learn in ways that play to their own strengths. So, how can our institutions respond to these challenges? Enter Universal Design for Learning, or UDL for short. UDL is an educational framework that guides the design of learning goals, materials, methods and assessments, as well as the policies surrounding these curricular elements, with the diversity of learners in mind. The framework was developed by US organisation CAST and is based on research in the field of neuroscience. It promotes 3 core principles for educators to build into their teaching practice, calling on them to provide students with multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression. The framework includes a set of guidelines on how you can turn these principles into practice. For example, by fostering collaboration with the introduction of group work with clear goals, roles, and responsibilities. By using different types of media to support learning and ensuring that all materials are accessible. And by providing a choice of assessment instruments while maintaining robust learning outcomes. You are probably already including some UDL elements in your practice without realising it, and there's much more to explore. So don't be afraid to let universal design for learning give you a new lens through which to look at your teaching and learning practice and help you to better reach all of your students. For more information and resources, visit ahead.ie/UDL.
Thanks, Carl. Sorry, thanks, Neil. So that would be great, because that, that if every program thought about their delivery in the model of UDL, it would mitigate a lot of the barriers. It would mitigate the need for additional time. That would be built in. Traditional exams would be an option for some. That's a great option, but for others, you could demonstrate it through other ways, through coursework, through presentations, through a range of media. So you're mitigating the barriers. It's not becoming a problem, and you're playing on the strengths of the individual. And this is the way we'd like to go in higher education. I know I'm part of my organisation within the NADP sector is that other universities are saying exactly the same thing. Getting there is a challenge. So this slide just explains some of the tensions and reality of implementing something like UDL. So it does require a radical shift in the curriculum design, and academics need support to do that. There are a lot of pressures on academic teams, and they do need support. And well, how do I change my mode of delivery? How can I use technology such as Panopto, etc. There are, especially at Southbank, actually, we do a lot of programs that have professional competencies. The School of Health and Social Care, nursing programs, law, etc. They do require adherence to a strict learning outcomes. So it can't be so creative. However, in my experience, there's been some great lecturers there, and they will work around the problem and still meet those professional competencies for individuals. There's an interesting report that's just come out. So in the UK, we have something called the Office for Students. They're a regulator for higher education institutions to ensure that we're doing the right job. It's the government supports, obviously, is funding or subsidising higher education, and they're there to ensure that we keep on the straight and narrow. And they released a paper called Assessment Practice in English. And it was quite a shocking paper, really. And even our Pro-Vice Chancellor shared the paper to me. She was hopping mad about it, because it was sort of saying that providers, you need to ensure that you're marking for written work and ensuring that the grammar and spelling is of a certain standard. And largely, this is what the taxpayer would require within higher education, as well as the employer. But it kind of contradicts everything we've been moving to in terms of universal design for learning, looking at different ways of providing assessment, as well as focusing on the learning outcomes. If it's a professional competency that students need to have a certain level of spelling, then yes, so be it, but not to mark down on that. My understanding of that, yes, lecturers should be making comments on an assignment that if there is poor spelling or grammar, just to make comments, but not to actually mark down on it, as well as it being a constructive tool to then be shared with the specialist dyslexia tutor that students will receive. At least an hour a week, they'll have a one-to-one specialist tutor to work with the student on that assignment. And if there are comments on the assignment, then they can look at it and help improve that. But really, to focus on the learning outcomes is the way we should be going. So finally, just to say, well, I think at the moment, our disability and dyslexia teams are here to stay. We need to be here because we need to ensure that adjustments are made and that neurodiversity is supported and considered in the curriculum, because at any time things could slip back, and hence we need to be forever sort of promoting the neurodiversity and the needs for all students. I've hopefully, yeah, I think I'm back on time. So I've left about 4 minutes or so for questions. If you just want to clarify any points raised, happy to do that.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for your presentation. Great to hear about all the fantastic work taking place at LSBU, even though I work there. So thank you for sharing. We have a few minutes for questions before we have a quick comfort break. And Sam, you have a question.
I do. I've probably got hundreds, but I'll try and keep it brief. Thank you, Jonathan, for your presentation. I'd just like to know how they calculate it in terms of the 25% uplift, because obviously everybody's dyslexia is different, and although you get more time, etc., how is that calculated? Is that based on the assessor's report, and how much that can help with this?
Yes, it is quite a crude sort of adjustment. It's at 25%, it will then jump to 33%, 50%, 75%, and we can give 100%. But initially, yes, the diagnostic assessor will usually put that in the report, a minimum of 25%. Some of them will actually recommend 33% if it's profoundly impacting on the student in a time-constrained situation. They'll be able to see that the processing speeds are being affected. So they will recommend 33%. So our disability advisor will look at the report, and in consultation with the student will arrive at that recommendation.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions at all for Jonathan?
Yeah, well, I just like to mention that I studied at University of Pretoria, and it was 100% white when I studied there. Now University of Pretoria is completely inclusive. It's quite amazing. And one thing I was quite proud of, things Jonathan talking about, is I was at one of Neil's events on sustainability, climate change things, and there was a speaker there from the Times Group. Neil will know more about it, and they ranked university worldwide on different criteria. And the person mentioned that London South Bank University is ranked, I forget whether it's top 15 or top 10, but the top 10 or 15 in the world on inclusivity, being included. And I must say, I'm very proud of that, being alumni from South Bank.
It's good to hear.
Thanks for sharing that, Carl. That's wonderful. Any other questions for Jonathan before we take a quick break? Tessa? Oh, you're on mute. There you go.
Yeah. Sorry, this is slightly off track, but I just wondered, I mean, obviously today is about dyslexia, but if I could just ask you, how much provision do you feel that you're able to make for those on the autistic spectrum? And obviously there's obviously comorbidity with dyslexic pupils or students.
Yes, there's a range of work that needs to be done there, but in terms of support, so students are provided a specialist mentor, so it's a bit like being provided with a specialist study skills tutor. They'll be provided with a specialist mentor to help with planning and prioritising of the workload. There is also, we provide sort of training and briefing sessions to program teams to understand the autistic spectrum and sort of the difficulties, the barriers around sort of working in groups, potentially in presentations. So we'll provide awareness in regard to that. And work closely with academic teams to draw up a support plan and individual learning plan around how that's impacting on the individual.
Thank you very much. We've got time for one more quick question. Ines, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan, for your talk. I'm quite interested. I hear more often nowadays that money is getting tighter and tighter, even at universities. It used to be that students were screened there And a lot of people were only told at university age that they are dyslexic. So I would be interested to know, is it that people already know what they need and come to you and you provide, or is there a screening process? And how is it in comparison to other universities? Is money really so incredibly tight, or do some universities get more money? How does it work?
The budget is allocated by their department. So we do have a fairly healthy budget at South Bank, and I manage a certain figure that will ensure that all students, that if they're unsure whether they are neurodiverse, we will encourage them to be screened, and we will pay that diagnostic assessment. It can so a lot of our students know they come to university. We have a lot of mature learners, and they've struggled in the past. They've been working, come back into education, and they really want to find out why they've been struggling. And they find out throughout, especially this time of year, the autumn term is quite critical to get the screening process done quickly, that they are dyslexic. And the pressure is on really to get the support in place before the first major examination in January, and coursework also due in same time as well. So there's this quite pressure cooker really to assessment in place, and the adjustments in place ready in time. But at the same time, this is why we need to promote more universal design for learning, that if we can mitigate the barriers right from the get-go, then the students will be fully included. The additional time's already built in. The lectures providing a whole range of modes of delivery and engagement that way to alleviate the pressures. But I believe we should always be funding one-to-one specialist statistical tuition.
Okay.
Because
and could I also ask, is your university, do they train teachers?
Sorry, do we train teachers?
Teachers, yeah. Do you do teacher training?
We do have an BA Honours in Education. I believe we do. I should know that.
We do.
I'm just putting this together because I mean, Carl was saying, and quite rightly, that something like the Davis method should get into schools. I believe, and we have discussed it amongst our organization, of course, it needs to go into teacher training as well. And if that would happen, then obviously, it would be more accessible to everybody, and it would not be, as you call it, elitist. Anyway, I don't want to jump the gun, but
if we could revisit that a bit later during the discussion, if that's okay, that's cool. I'm very keen for everyone to grab a 2-minute comfort break before Sam's session. So we are just going to pause the recording and we'll be back in 2 minutes. Thank you.